are running on an anti-Trump platform. I mean, they have other parts of their platform as well, but part of their appeal is that they are the anti-Trump, and this is something that we're seeing happening around the world right now. It is not a positive outcome.
Alex, I want to ask you this. You know, earlier we were speaking to Jung Pak, Dr. Jung Pak from the Center for East Asia Policy Studies, and she pointed out something. She felt that there was wiggle room to come back to the table for two reasons. Not only does the president say, if you change your mind, you can give me a call or write me, but also because the most heated rhetoric that we've been hearing from the administration and from North Korea has not been coming directly from the two leaders. They've been coming from their various underlings. And if there's one thing we sort of know about President Trump is there's a sort of person-to-person connection that he really likes. He likes sort of face-to-face meetings, and there's he certainly gives the impression that he believes once you're with him, standing in front of him, perhaps there's a charm offensive that's there that isn't there in his Twitter feed. But I want to ask you, Alex, do you think that there's some wiggle room, particularly because much of the heated rhetoric is not coming from the two leaders, but coming from people within their administrations?
Well, the Trump administration, Trump's letter certainly left open that possibility, and it throws the ball squarely into Kim Jong Un's court. Look, as you say, Trump's style, and this has been true since he was, a real estate magnate in New York in the 1980s, is just get me into the room with the guy, and I can make it happen. Right. But another key aspect of his negotiating style is that, he says he's willing to walk away from the table if he doesn't like what he sees. I think, that approach can work if you're negotiating the construction of skyscrapers in Manhattan and casinos in Atlantic City. Unfortunately, when it comes to global diplomacy on issues of this sensitivity, when this level of structural complexity, it simply may not work. But the door is still open, right? You can see in the language of the letter that they're leaving an opportunity for Kim to respond and sort of beat a path back to Trump. Trump seems to be expecting that Kim will tone down his language and apologize. I'm not sure if that's really Kim's style, but the opening is certainly there.
Yeah, that's the big question, right? I mean, you're talking about two leaders who have similar tendencies to bluster in public about things, and I wonder if this isn't just I don't want to say it's a slap in the face, but if this was a surprise to Chairman Kim, then you would expect that just for saving face within his own nation, with his own, the thing that Alex...
Because these are two men, that image is very important to them.
It's not just the image, and it is very important to them, but Alex, you can talk a little bit about this, right? He is a young leader. He has proven, according to Secretary of State Mike Pompeo, to be very adept at understanding the issues and the concerns, but he is a young, unproven, untested leader who has two generations of family members that he has to live up to. And he is surrounded by people. Then there's a lot of palace intrigue, and we may not be that aware of it, but there is a lot of palace intrigue within North Korea, probably certain factions who don't see him as a viable leader. I wonder how this will play to those individuals and to the rest of the country. I get it that North Korea will tell the people whatever they think that they need to know, and they may never know about what's going on here, but I just wonder internally within the palace how that will play.
Well, for a moment when you said an untested, unproven leader with lots of palace intrigue, I thought maybe you were talking about the White House. But anyway, but to your point, look, certainly there are lots of machinations going on within the North Korean leadership that we certainly don't know about. But one could, if people around Kim, Kim, let's be honest, Kim killed lots of people in order to establish his power, right? So he certainly presumably has enemies within the regime and around him in North Korea. They don't know, but that if the young leader, as you say, appears to be not handling this well, that could create a fissure or an opening for some other officials to try to challenge his power. I certainly have no idea who that would be. I'm not enough of an expert on North Korea itself. But any situation in which you have an authoritarian leadership that appears to be losing the plot or slipping on a key issue of national security like this certainly creates openings for others to try to fill the gap or do it better.
Yeah, definitely. So we're just sort of reminding everyone, that we are waiting to hear from the president. It was supposed to be about 10 minutes ago or so. Clearly he's running behind, but the expectation is that we'll hear from him directly. Earlier today, the Secretary of State Mike Pompeo was testifying. It was supposed to be about budget needs, but instead, of course, many questions about North Korea. And one of the things that Mike Pompeo said was that, you know, the president indicated that he didn't like some of the language he was hearing from North Korea, but on the inside, where all the work was being done, that the Secretary of State was putting together teams to go forward with the summit. In the last few days, they simply stopped hearing from North Korea, and that was also part of the reason why we're seeing the U.S. pull out of this, at least for now. So, Alex, I ask you, is that sort of surprising to you that the North Koreans would be at least lackluster when it came to really sort of finalizing the details of the summit?
Well, it was very difficult to know what the process, the diplomatic process that was going on was. I mean, this is to Marcos's point earlier. It wasn't clear that there was a real and concerted and substantive effort to go about the preparations for negotiations of this kind in the way that they normally are. But look, I mean, clearly someone, and probably people on both sides, dropped the ball on this, and now we are where we are.
All right, Alex, Clement from the Eurasia Group, thank you, my friend, as always, for joining us. Marcos, if you can stick around, we'll continue on with you talking about this development as we await for the President of the United States to approach that podium there and make some remarks. This, of course, after he fired off a letter just about 2 hours ago informing Kim Jong Un, the dictator of North Korea, that he is canceling the proposed summit that was to take place on June 12th in Singapore. In the letter, Mr. Trump says that he is doing this based on the, quote, tremendous anger and open hostility displayed in your most recent statement. He does, Marcos, leave the door open to perhaps restarting this discussion as to whether or not they're even going to have a summit, at one point saying, if you change your mind having to do with this most important summit, please do not hesitate to call me or write. It just is striking, and when you look at this letter, and you know, people are now starting to react to the letter itself and the way that it was written. At one point, Marcos, he writes here, he says, and then I'm going to quote the letter here because I think it's interesting. Please let this letter serve to represent that the Singapore summit, for the good of both parties, but to the detriment of the world, will not take place. What do you think the president means? For the good of both parties, but to the detriment of the world?
You know, it's interesting you should say that the policy that he's written about is really "Call Me Maybe." I think that was a very popular song for a while. What he means is that he sees it as a win-win. Somehow he was going to provide Kim with security guarantees. It seemed to be a promise of economic support and maybe even investment in North Korea. So I think President Trump perceived that this was going to be a win for North Korea economically and even for regime support and security. For the United States, well, any win for President Trump is perceived as a win by him for the United States. He doesn't necessarily perceive that giving away certain things are loss for the United States. Anything that he can conceive of and perceive of and sell as a political win for him and his presidency is a win from his perspective for the U.S. He may have given away an awful lot. We still don't know about this, Vlad, because this is something that you mentioned earlier, the role of the Chinese within these negotiations. What are we giving away? What are the negotiating points? There are suggestions, and Senator Rubio is one of those who suggested this, that the ZTE deal, the one where there is a technology transfer and sale to this Chinese company that the United States has considered a national security threat, that in fact part of that deal was on the table in order to entice North Korea to enter into these negotiations. As we look at the picture right now that we're looking at in the White House with Secretary Mnuchin in the background, we have to wonder, what was he negotiating when he was recently in Beijing? Was there a direction and a directive from the White House, from the president, to make sure that he can negotiate certain aspects of the trade deal or the deficit requirement, the deficit deal that we're trying to cut with the Chinese, in order to entice and move Kim towards these negotiations? A lot of unanswered questions. The negotiations, I think, as you said, are still on the table in some form, and maybe Kim will write or call.
Okay, so Marcus, what about this? What about this maybe being a win for Kim Jong Un in a way? He gets to keep his nuclear arsenal. On the world stage, he looks reasonable. He was certainly looking pretty reasonable when he had that summit with the president of South Korea. They looked sort of chummy and jovial. And at the end of the day, it's the U.S. that pulled away from this summit. They really haven't, North Korea really hasn't given up much in exchange for having that validation on the world stage. So maybe this works out a little bit for him.
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I was on one of your programs a few weeks back when this was first announced. And what I said was that Kim got everything he needed. He got international legitimacy. He got the President Trump to say nice things about him, call him an honorable man. He was able to attract the attention of the world community. He was seen as someone willing to do what no other nuclear power has done, which is consider giving up their nuclear weapons. Excuse me, let me take that back. There have been countries that have given them back. Ukraine and Belarus and Kazakhstan gave up their weapons to Russia at the end of the fall of the Soviet Union. But no country since then that has nuclear capabilities has been willing to give up their nuclear weapons. So suddenly, Kim is on the world stage looking like a great leader and as someone who is reasonable. And he's able to maintain his repressive regime, the tight control that he has on all of that state, maintain whatever it is that allows him to be considered a deity in his own country. And at the same time, he's able to open negotiations with South Korea and try to co-opt the country to the south, which he is holding hostage with the weapons that he has pointed at them, and say, look, let's get together, forget about the Americans, let's work things out between us, because he is suddenly given this amazing legitimacy on the world stage.
Mm-hmm.
Marcos Koulianakis, the foreign affairs columnist for McClatchy, your insight and analysis have proven to be very valuable for our viewers. We thank you for sharing them with us. Next up, I guess, since the president has put in this letter that Kim Jong Un should either call or write him,
right.
Since Jared Kushner has now received his security clearances, I'm expecting the Middle East peace process to take back up. I wonder how difficult that will be, given that this is with an adversary and Israel is an ally of the United States. Will be interesting.
You know, I think that's a really interesting point, Vlad, because I think we've also seen that being a pattern with this administration, that oftentimes there's a lot of focus on something, whether it's an investigation or whatever the president is interested in at the time, and then it just sort of disappears into the ether and we don't hear anything more about it again. And I wondered to myself, what will he pivot to now? What will be the focus?
Right, and the fact is that this is a difficult negotiation with an adversary of the United States. Some would even call it perhaps even an enemy of the United States. And now you're talking about with an ally, and it might prove to be just as difficult. Mm-hmm. And we'll have to see how it all plays out. Marcus, thank you so much. We really appreciate it. All right, he is left. Right, so earlier we were speaking to Dr. June Park. She is a senior fellow at the Brookings Institute. We had a really interesting discussion with her about a number of things related to this interesting development from the White House. Let's play a little bit of that.
I think that what's important to note that it wasn't Kim Jong Un who canceled the meeting, and that it was President Trump who canceled the meeting. So that puts the onus of Washington for delaying or stopping progress on talking about the nuclear weapons program. So I think, so Kim has let his deputies and his lieutenants do the war of words for the most part, and he has stayed above the fray in this scenario.
That's an interesting point. What you're saying, in fact, is because this letter came directly from the office of the president and is signed by the president, this war of words that we've seen over the last couple of days have been either Vice President Pence making some comments to Fox News or underlings under Kim Jong Un. And by the president sending this letter, you think that that's a different message than one utilizing the Secretary of State, for example?
Well, I think it's important that that still leaves some space for the meeting to go forward. President Trump's letter was a cancellation, but not a cancellation, in that he spoke so highly about how he was looking forward to the dialogue, and that only you and I can solve this problem, and it's too bad that we couldn't work this out. So I think there's still an opening. I think there's also still an opening because Kim has not responded, and some of the comments that have been coming from North Korea have not been coming from Kim directly. So I still think that there's still some wiggle room for a postponement or an eventual resetting of another date.
So then do you think this letter, this cancellation, is just sort of more tactics, more sort of art of the deal? Like when the president says we're going to rip up NAFTA and then he says, well, you know what, we'll renegotiate NAFTA. Do you think that's what we're seeing here?
I think it's important to note what Kim might be seeing from his vantage point. Mm-hmm. I think the administration's message on what it plans to say and bring up and what their goals are for the administration have been pretty muddled, with the National Security Advisor Bolton saying one thing, Secretary of State Pompeo saying something else about economic carrots. So I think and President Trump saying that, whether the Libya model is out or Libya model's in. So it's been a mishmash of mixed messaging from the administration. So from Kim's perspective, I would think that there is some confusion or policy dysfunction on the side of the U.S. but that ultimately, President Trump acts on his own. It's not entirely on his own, or if he has informed the foreign ministers from East Asia who were in town, and how this decision came about in the first place.
You talk about, what's really important is how Kim Jong Un is perceiving this. I can't help but to think about the timing. The president thanked Kim Jong Un in the letter for releasing the Americans. This is the day that North Korea says they are destroying their nuclear testing site, and they invited Western journalists as well as journalists from South Korea to witness that destruction. When I think about the Libya model, the idea that, promises are made but maybe not kept, it seems like North Korea has been following through to a certain degree, giving the administration what they asked for in return for this summit. And now the summit's, at least for now, off the table.
I think Kim has a couple of options. One is he can be angry and put his foot down and then, dig his heels in and then shoot back at President Trump, rhetorically, that is. The other option is that he can continue to put on the charm, if not with the U.S., then continue doing so with South Korea and with China. And that's what he has been doing since January, turning on the charm with Beijing and Seoul as insurance policies in case the summit with the U.S. president either fails or doesn't go through.
All right, you have just been listening to a conversation, and here comes the President of the United States. He's expected now to speak at that podium there, and this, of course, in the wake of that letter. Let's go to a special report from CBS News.
This is a CBS News special report. I'm John Dickerson in New York. President Trump is about to speak at the White House, his first comments since canceling plans for a summit meeting with North Korean dictator Kim Jong Un.
I'd like to begin by saying that based on the recent statement of North Korea, I have decided to terminate the planned summit in Singapore on June 12th. While many things can happen and a great opportunity lies ahead potentially, I believe that this is a tremendous setback for North Korea and indeed a setback for the world. I've spoken to General Mattis and the Joint Chiefs of Staff and our military, which is by far the most powerful anywhere in the world, that has been greatly enhanced recently, as you all know, is ready if necessary. Likewise, I have spoken to South Korea and Japan, and they are not only ready should foolish or reckless acts be taken by North Korea, but they are willing to shoulder much of the cost of any financial burden, any of the costs associated by the United States in operations if such an unfortunate situation is forced upon us. Hopefully, positive things will be taking place with respect to the future of North Korea. But if they don't, we are more ready than we have ever been before. North Korea has the opportunity to end decades of poverty and oppression by following the path of denuclearization and joining the community of nations. And I hope that Kim Jong Un will ultimately do what is right, not only for himself, but perhaps most importantly, what's right for his people, who are suffering greatly and needlessly. All of the Korean people, North and South, deserve to be able to live together in harmony, prosperity, and peace. That bright and beautiful future can only happen when the threat of nuclear weapons is removed. No way it can happen otherwise. If and when Kim Jong Un chooses to engage in constructive dialogue and actions, I am waiting. In the meantime, our very strong sanctions, by far the strongest sanctions ever imposed, and maximum pressure campaign will continue, as it has been continuing. But no matter what happens and what we do, we will never, ever compromise the safety and security of the United States of America. I want to make that statement, feel very, very strongly about it. Our military, as you know, has been greatly enhanced. Will soon be at a level that it's never been before. Our approval of $700 billion this year and $716 billion next year, largely due to the help of a lot of the people with me today and standing right here. We appreciate. But we had to do that for our military, and we've done it, and hopefully everything's going to work out well with North Korea. And a lot of things can happen, including the fact that perhaps, and would wait, it's possible that the existing summit could take place or a summit at some later date. Nobody should be anxious. We have to get it right. Okay. With that being said, we have something else, which I have to tell you, all of you, Chairman, Mike, and everybody, it was a big deal until this came up. I don't know. Where's Mike Crapo? Where are you? Mike, congratulations.
Right, the president there in the Roosevelt Room. He said that the opportunity lies ahead potentially, but then spoke about having gotten in touch with his Secretary of Defense, the Joint Chiefs, and said that the military was ready and that allies in the region would pick up the cost if there was any military action. We want to go now to Major Garrett, who is at the White House. Major, the president also said to Kim Jong Un, "I am waiting," and he said nobody should be anxious, speaking, of course, to Americans.
No one should be anxious. We want to get this right. A couple of things worth pointing out about that last statement. We want to get this right. John, it is clear at the White House, has been all week, that there was a sense internally that not only were the North Koreans backing away, but that the administration itself needed a bit more time to prepare adequately. The new National Security Advisor, John Bolton, doesn't have his team fully prepared here at the White House. Similarly, at the State Department, Mike Pompeo was building his team. It would have been an enormous task for both of those teams to organize themselves rapidly enough and effectively enough to carry on the high-level and high-intensity negotiations contemplated even before the scheduled June 12th summit. So getting it right became an important factor for this administration, separate from the North Korean statements, which were clearly bellicose and harmful. One other thing it's worth pointing out, the president, by talking first about the U.S. military and consulting his military advisors, even before mentioning conversations with the South Korean and Japanese government, is sending a signal to the North Koreans that this president believes it has been that threat of military action in a way that no previous American president has so publicly stated that drove Kim Jong Un to the precipice of this summit in the first place. That's the president's belief. Whether or not the North Koreans share that, we don't know. But it is now going back to where the president was before the summit was possible. We are going to threaten you with military activity. If you don't abandon your nuclear weapons program, that is a real prospect. So we're now back to where we were 3 or 4 months ago. The implication being the rhetoric may heat up and the sense of anxiety, regardless of what the president just told the country, is likely to increase.
That's right. The president said people shouldn't get anxious, but he also said we are more ready than we have ever been before, speaking of military readiness. Major, put your finger on it, if it's possible. What caused this? You mentioned the bellicose language, but the Secretary of State also said, Mike Pompeo said, that the North Koreans weren't responding to the preparations needed for this actual summit on the 12th. So what was the cause, the proximate cause for this calling off of the summit?
I don't think it would be accurate to identify a single cause, but there were several. The lack of preparations, the lack of visible seriousness on the part of North Koreans, the increasing unease on the part of the administration about whether or not they would show up, and if they did, would they have anything really serious to talk about. And the rhetoric from the North Koreans can't be discounted. Vice President Pence holds a special place in the Trump world. President Trump regards him highly. Mike Pompeo, the Secretary of State, does as well. And when the North Koreans call him a political dummy, well, that's the kind of insult that no administration can ignore, least of all this one. And when the North Koreans at least imply that there could be some sort of nuclear conflict, it's one, John, we should point out, at least in regards to the United States, the North Koreans are incapable of waging. Yes, they possess nuclear weapons, but they do not possess the intercontinental ballistic missile technology necessary to deliver them to the mainland. Nevertheless, that rhetoric cannot be ignored. And in the context of all this shifting sense of how real or unreal these talks might be, that was probably the most convenient off-ramp for the president. And it's worth noting, John, this president has often said about deals in general, sometimes it's important to walk away. He's walking away to see if these can be restarted in a different context and possibly at a different time.
Let me pick up on that quickly, Major, that point of walking away. This president is a negotiator. He ran for office on that. Give us your sense, though. You know the history of these things. They're not often negotiated in public. This one has been quite public. The president's been engaged. How has that affected the way this has gone forward?
Well, the president jumped a lot of typical processes by agreeing to this summit before he had a team ready to negotiate the underlying details and had any sense of what was achievable. That is different. This president does many things at the presidential level that are very different. What is most important to conclude, though, is though that was a different technique and sort of jumped way ahead of the process, either at the State Department, Pentagon, or National Security Council, the results for this country and this administration bear a stark and striking resemblance to previous administrations. Engagement with North Koreans that appears promising, only to end in disappointment and frustration.
All right, Major Garrett, I want to bring in CBS News political correspondent Ed O'Keefe, who is with us. Ed, what do you make of this?
Look, he's operating here from a position of strength. This is somebody who has total control over foreign policy. This was a decision he made on his own. And with everything that happens in this presidency, it came in dramatic fashion. There was a letter released this morning by the White House that reads like an emotional breakup letter. The problem is it has global ramifications. Reading just from one part of it here, in one sentence, he says, "You talk about your nuclear capabilities, but ours are so massive and powerful that I pray to God they will never have to be used." In the next sentence, however, "I felt a wonderful dialogue was building up between you and me, and ultimately it is only that dialogue that matters. someday I look very much forward to meeting you. So you can see sort of the yin and the yang there, trying to be tough, but also leaving open the door to possibly doing this again.
That's right. And even in his remarks here today, he said the summit might happen either at the date or in a future date. Ed O'Keefe, thanks so much. Coverage will continue throughout our day on your local news station and on this CBS station and on our 24-hour streaming network, CBSN. Watch it at cbsnews.com. And we'll have a full wrap-up tonight on the CBS Evening News with Jeff Glor. This has been a CBS News special report. I'm John Dickerson, CBS News, New York.
For news 24 hours a day, go to cbsnews.com.
Hearing from the president for the first time since the release of that letter, and the president not only reiterating what was in the letter, but also sort of doubling down in terms of our military commitment if North Korea was to pursue something beyond diplomacy.
Let's go straight to Major Garrett, who is reporting from the White House for us. Major, good to see you. It is striking that the President of the United States, in making remarks, the first remarks since this letter was released, immediately sort of switched to the rhetoric of our military being the most powerful military in the world and that they stand at the ready.
That's right. And it's important that emphasis. Remarks like this are calibrated. They're calculated in advance to send signals throughout the world community. And by starting with a reference to, I've talked to my defense secretary, I've talked to the Joint Chiefs of Staff, the military is ready. We've talked to our allies immediately in the region, the Japanese, the South Koreans. They're ready to pay associated costs should something military have to be undertaken. All of that as a prelude to saying now, if things get back on track, a lot of promising things can happen to the North Koreans. What does this tell us? That the theory of the case, that President Trump's theory about dealing with North Korea is that this summit was even possible because he was so aggressive in threatening military action as deterrence for the North Koreans obtaining what it clearly doesn't have yet but is working toward, not only a nuclear weapons capability, which it possesses, but the intercontinental ballistic missile technology necessary to deliver it or threaten the United States of America on the mainland. That's something this president has said is unacceptable, will not be tolerated, and military action will be used to stop. That's where the conversation now goes back to, which is where it was 3 or 4 months ago, before prospects of a summit began to take shape. And remember, they took shape first, quite informally and delicately, when Vice President Pence went to the Winter Olympics in Pyeongchang. There were lots of signals, some of them formal, some of them very nuanced, about the possibility of working something out. The North Koreans were there, the South Koreans were there. Lots of things were sort of suggested might be possible. It was that stepping off point that led to the conversations about a possible summit. So when the North Koreans insulted Vice President Pence, calling him a political dummy, threatening a nuclear war that they cannot wage with the United States, that was effectively a rhetorical straw that broke the camel's back. But lots of other things were signaling to this administration things were getting off track, and it was better to get out of this summit than to continue to pursue something unlikely to happen, or, if it did happen, unlikely to be productive.
Yeah, well, the Secretary of State said earlier today that one of the things that was happening behind the scenes is as the Trump administration was gathering together teams for this summit over the past few days, they were not hearing from the North Koreans and wondered whether or not they were doing the same. Some have suggested, though, Major, that maybe neither side was thoroughly prepared for this summit, though the Secretary of State has pushed back on that, insisting that the Americans are. And